Hey, Living Way family. Happy Good Friday, or so we call it. It really is, if you think about it, probably the darkest day in human history. But as we've talked about, it is a joyful day, even though it's a solemn day. Today, we celebrate the cross of Christ. It was on this day 2,000 years ago that Jesus was crucified, which in my mind is the worst atrocity, the worst crime, probably the most heinous act ever committed in history. And yet this evil happened exactly as God had ordained it to happen, because our God reigns. The thing is, when we watch the evening news, it doesn't always seem like he reigns. I know we know that is a biblical fact, but sometimes if we're honest, we can just get so overwhelmed with the news, it just doesn't seem like he's the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. Pardon the geese flying overhead. I'm walking down here by the American River. You've got the coronavirus killing people. There's still murders happening. I was reading earlier about some churches that are being demonized for just upholding the traditional values that a man is a man and a woman is a woman. So if we're honest, sometimes in our mind, it just seems like Christ isn't actually reigning. But then again, if we're honest, it doesn't seem like he was reigning on Good Friday 2,000 years ago. It didn't look like he reigned that day either. Remember, Jesus said in John chapter 18, he said, "My kingdom's not of this world." He said, if my kingdom were of this world, then my servants would have been fighting that I wouldn't be handed over to the Jews. But my kingdom's not of this world. And we need to remind ourselves at times that his kingdom doesn't have borders like the Roman Empire or even the United States does. His kingdom doesn't have to win battles for everyone to see. His kingdom is spiritual, and it does us good to remind ourselves that the evening news should not ever dictate our theology. Christ reigns, and his kingdom will endure forever. In fact, the psalmist says that he will break his foes with a rod of iron and will dash them to pieces like a potter's vessel. I think that's in Psalm chapter 2. Despite how things sometimes appear, his kingdom exists and it alone will last forever. So with everything happening in the world, I want to remind you on this Good Friday, don't allow yourself to forget this truth. On that Good Friday, all of the powers of this world were they were united, they were aligned, and in their mockery of God. And if we're being honest, they actually appeared to be successful. 2,000 years ago, this day, Good Friday, this was the moment when the world's voice was loudest and most unified. The religious establishment, represented by the Pharisees and the scribes and the Sadducees, brought charges against him. Earthly government sanctioned his death. Fallen man cried out for his crucifixion. Satan and his demons seemingly had their way. The plot seemed to have worked. The kingdom of God seemed to be folly. Their victory was so sure that they even mocked him. With a purple robe and a crown of thorns, they placed a placard above his head that read, "King of the Jews." And his kingdom, if we're honest at this moment, appeared to be feeble and weak and non-existent. And yet, in that moment, when the world seemed to be holding all the aces, when the world seemed to have gotten an insurmountable lead, when they seemed to have all the power and they're going to win, the power of God in that moment echoed and reverberated throughout the entirety of the universe. Shortly after 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Jesus from the cross whispered hoarsely for a drink, and in love he had drained out the cup of his Father's wrath. He had borne our full curse. There's no debt left to pay. He's got nothing left to give. The vinegar moistens his mouth enough for him to utter one final word. He says, "It is finished." And Jesus became sin. He bears our punishment. He suffers the wrath of the Father in our place, the righteous for the unrighteous, that he might bring us to God. Forgiveness and reconciliation and redemption, a kingdom that cannot be shaken, is born in that moment. And listen, Listen, don't forget this. Our God reigns. With everything that you're hearing about in the news, I know it's so easy to get overwhelmed. Listen, do not stress. Do not worry about it. Do not worry about anything. You will see, listen, every Nebuchadnezzar will fall. Every Ahab will reach his end. Every virus will be cured. This perishable will be clothed in imperishable. This mortality will put on immortality. And the head of the serpent will be crushed, and death will finally die. God's kingdom has already been established, and regardless of news headlines, it will continue forevermore. So no matter what apparent setbacks we witness, just remember, Jesus is alive, and he reigns forevermore. No matter what we see, no matter what comes on the news, he reigns. In the darkest of dark, when hope seems to have gone, when the news is so overwhelming, don't worry. There is a throne above, and it is not empty. Happy Good Friday, guys. Love ya.